The air in East Prussia felt heavy on the morning of 17 August 1943. The war was already in its fourth brutal year, and the German Air Force had begun to feel the strain in ways that statistics alone could not explain. At Rassenburg, near the headquarters of the German leadership, a luxury train stood ready on a quiet railway platform. Its polished carriages and attentive staff felt strangely out of step with the exhausted nation it served. On that platform stood Adolf Galland, the general responsible for fighter operations. He had spent years in the cockpit, fighting over the Channel and across Western Europe. He carried not only the marks of combat on his uniform, but also a clear understanding of how quickly the balance in the air could shift. In front of him, preparing to board the train, was Hermann Göring, the man who held ultimate authority over the German Air Force. Between them lay a gap that was no longer just about rank, but about reality itself. Earlier that day, reports had poured into Galland's headquarters from fighter units scattered across the Reich. The American Army Air Forces had launched a major twin raid against Regensburg in southern Germany and Schweinfurt in northern Bavaria. The targets were critical: aircraft factories and ball-bearing plants that fed the entire German war machine. The attacks followed a pattern that German planners thought they understood. American heavy bombers crossed the coast accompanied by escort fighters. Those escorts, usually Thunderbolts, would eventually reach the limit of their fuel and turn back. That moment, the point where the bombers were left alone, had always been the opening the German fighter arm relied upon. But on this day something had changed. Pilots reported that once the usual escorts disappeared, new fighters appeared far deeper inside Germany than anyone expected. They were not Thunderbolts. They had twin booms, long wings, and a distinctive profile that pilots recognized as Lockheed Lightnings. These Lightnings were not limping stragglers or damaged aircraft caught far from home. They arrived high, fast, and ready to fight. German pilots clashed with them over Schweinfurt and Regensburg, more than 100 miles inside German airspace, at ranges that had been considered safe from escort fighters. As Galland collected the reports, a pattern emerged. The Lightnings were carrying external fuel tanks under their wings and fuselage. These drop tanks extended their range dramatically, allowing them to escort bombers far beyond the theoretical limits that German planners had assumed. It was not an isolated incident or a fluke of wind and altitude. Multiple squadrons, spread across a wide stretch of German territory, had seen the same thing on the same day. The evidence pointed in one direction only. The era of predictable escort limits was over. That realization is what brought Galland to the platform at Rassenburg, determined to speak with Göring before the train pulled away. There would not be many chances to present this intelligence directly. He knew that what he had to say would not be welcome. It suggested that one of the fundamental pillars of German air strategy was now obsolete. For years, the German fighter arm had organized its interceptions around the assumption that American escorts would peel away at the edge of their range, leaving bombers exposed. If escorts could now stay with the bombers all the way to key targets, the entire defensive system would need to be reconsidered. In later accounts, witnesses recalled how Galland's expression carried a mix of urgency and calm as he approached his superior. He had prepared his case with the same methodical care he used when planning a fighter sweep. Distances, times, fuel calculations, and pilot testimonies all pointed to the same conclusion. American fighters had gained the ability to accompany bombers deep into the Reich. The German fighter arm would soon face an enemy with far more freedom to dictate when and where to fight. What he encountered instead was a wall of disbelief. Göring had long presented the German Air Force as an unshakable shield over the Reich, a force that would keep the war away from German cities and industry. The idea that enemy escorts could roam over central Germany at will did not fit that image. Accepting Galland's information would mean admitting that the strategic situation had shifted in favor of the enemy. It would also mean that the current leadership had allowed this change to arrive without preparation. The reports Galland carried were not vague impressions. They included detailed after-action summaries from experienced squadron leaders. They described Lightnings attacking at full power, not gliding in with dead engines. They described coordinated interceptions, not isolated encounters with damaged aircraft drifting off course. They mentioned drop tanks jettisoned in combat, falling away as American pilots engaged German fighters. Every line in those reports undermined the comforting belief that escort range would remain fixed. Yet the man boarding the train chose to treat this intelligence as an inconvenience rather than a warning. He preferred explanations that preserved his assumptions. He insisted that any American fighters seen that far inside Germany must have been damaged, forced eastward by wind, or carried along by altitude and momentum. He framed them as accidents, not signs of a new capability. In doing so, he turned a clear signal of change into something that could be dismissed. Galland understood more than just the technical side of air combat. He knew how organizations behaved when confronted with bad news. Facts that suggested vulnerability were often quietly set aside, especially when they threatened reputations at the top. On that platform, he realized that he was not simply arguing about aircraft performance. He was colliding with a mindset that preferred denial to adaptation. The order that followed, an insistence that no American fighters had penetrated so deeply, did not change the reality outside. It merely silenced the discussion inside the headquarters that needed it most. As the luxury train finally pulled away from the station, steel wheels grinding along the tracks, Galland was left standing on the platform with his reports and his calculations. Somewhere to the west, the smoke from the Regensburg and Schweinfurt raids still hung in the sky. American crews were counting their own heavy losses. German pilots were landing, or failing to land, after exhausting battles. On paper, the air defense of the Reich still existed, and its command structure still seemed intact. In practice, a fault line had just opened. A general with frontline experience had identified a threat that would shape the rest of the air war. The leader above him had chosen to declare that threat impossible. Between those two positions lay the future of thousands of pilots and the fate of Germany's control over its own airspace. At that moment in August 1943, the outcome was not yet fully visible, but the direction of travel was already set. The Lightnings with their drop tanks had crossed an invisible boundary. The question was whether the German Air Force would adapt in time, or whether this morning on a quiet platform in East Prussia would mark the beginning of a long, unstoppable decline. The same date that Galland stood on the platform in East Prussia, the twin raids against Regensburg and Schweinfurt were still unfolding across the sky. Over southern Germany, formations of American heavy bombers pressed on toward aircraft factories along the Danube. Farther north, another stream of bombers drove toward the ball-bearing plants whose products kept German engines turning. Where planners had once drawn neat arcs on maps to mark the safe limits of escort fighters, reality was now carving its own lines in contrails and smoke. German fighter units scrambled in waves, just as they had done on earlier raids. Controllers guided them by radio toward the bomber corridors. Pilots climbed through cloud layers, gathered in loose formations, and prepared for the familiar pattern. They expected to see American escort fighters peel away somewhere near the border, turning back toward the sea while the bombers continued on alone. That was the moment every German pilot had been trained to exploit. It was the point when the bombers would be exposed, slower and less agile, relying only on their own guns. Instead, in sector after sector, German pilots found something else. When they broke through the haze above Schweinfurt, there were Lightnings already circling at altitude. When they closed on the Regensburg stream, more Lightnings appeared from height and from the sun, dropping their emptied fuel tanks as they dived. The escorts did not vanish at the expected line. They followed the bombers into the heart of the Reich, fighting there with full tanks and full ammunition. By the end of that day, around 24 German fighters had been destroyed in combat, many of them by the very long-range escorts that official orders insisted did not exist. Some units returned to base with half their aircraft missing. Others landed with shot-up machines and wounded pilots, counting themselves fortunate simply to have survived. American losses were heavy as well. Dozens of heavy bombers failed to return, leaving gaps in the carefully spaced formations. Crews who did make it home carried stories of flak bursts and head-on attacks by determined German pilots. Yet for the German fighter arm, the numbers hid a deeper problem. In the past, such a day might have been framed as costly but favorable. Losing a few fighters in exchange for several dozen bombers had once looked like a sustainable trade. Now, in the reports that flowed through Galland's headquarters, a new pattern emerged. More German pilots were dying in each interception, and fewer bombers were being destroyed for every fighter lost. In the weeks that followed, this pattern hardened into something that could be measured. Raid after raid showed the same grim arithmetic. Fighters that attacked when they believed escorts had already turned back found themselves surprised by lightnings waiting above or behind the bomber stream. Tactical habits that had once been reliable were now leading pilots into traps. Squadron leaders amended their internal briefings, warning their men to expect escorts much deeper inside the country. Official doctrine, however, did not shift. The order from above still described such sightings as anomalies. On the 6th of September, 1943, a raid aimed at Stuttgart confirmed the new reality in a way that no one who flew that day would forget. Among the German pilots climbing to meet the bombers was Major Egon Mayer, one of the most experienced bomber hunters in the fighter arm. He had refined the dangerous head-on attack, approaching the heavy formations from their forward aspect where their defensive fire was concentrated, but where a well-flown fighter could exploit a narrow window of vulnerability. Mayer and his squadron positioned themselves ahead of the incoming bomber stream. They climbed into the cold, thin air, set their engines to combat power, and rushed straight into the mass of oncoming aircraft. For a moment, the familiar pattern held. Tracer fire laced the gaps between bombers, and Mayer's men saw their own rounds striking wings and engines. A few heavy aircraft began to drift out of formation, trailing smoke. Then the sky above them erupted. Long-legged American fighters dropped from higher altitude, having waited there unseen while the German formation committed itself to the attack. The lightnings fell upon Mayer's squadron with the advantage of height and speed. German pilots who had focused every thought on the bombers suddenly found enemy fighters diving through their midst. The formation shattered as men threw their aircraft into desperate maneuvers. Some escaped in steep dives, plunging toward the lower clouds and the safety of thick air. Others did not. When Mayer's unit tallied its strength after landing, the outcome was dismal. Several fighters were missing. Pilots who had spent years honing their skills against bombers were now dead or prisoners, forced from their machines by plumes of smoke or flames in the cockpit. No confirmed bomber destruction could balance the cost. What had been planned as a deliberate assault on a vulnerable formation had turned into a lopsided engagement against escorts with superior positioning. Back at headquarters, Galland began to assemble his own view of the war using numbers rather than impressions. He requested monthly summaries of losses from each fighter wing. He noted not just how many aircraft had been destroyed, but how many pilots had been killed or wounded. He compared those figures with the output of training schools and the number of new pilots arriving at the front. The picture that emerged from June through October of 1943 was sobering. In June, the fighter force had lost fewer than 100 aircraft. In July, the losses climbed into 3 digits. August was worse still, not just because of the Regensburg and Schweinfurt raids, but because long-range escorts were beginning to appear on more routes and at more depths. September and October continued the trend. Each month demanded more pilots than the previous one. Each month, the share of experienced men within the squadrons shrank further. Galland did not rely only on raw totals. He asked for estimates of pilot experience, expressed in months at the front and total flying hours. Early in the summer, most frontline pilots had accumulated half a year or more of combat flying. By autumn, that balance had flipped. Veterans were being lost faster than they could be replaced, and the replacements arriving from the schools often had only a few months of intensive training, much of it compressed due to fuel shortages. In his reports to the Air Ministry and to Göring, Galland laid out the trend with the same clarity he had used when describing the lightnings over Schweinfurt. He argued that the fighter force was approaching a critical point where losses would outpace the ability of the training system to supply competent replacements. He warned that the apparent strength on paper, measured in aircraft and unit names, would mask a hollowing of real combat capability as seasoned pilots vanished. The responses he received spoke less about production figures and training needs, and more about morale and willpower. Directives from above called for increased aggressiveness, renewed fighting spirit, and a refusal to be intimidated by the growing numbers of enemy aircraft. There were instructions to attack more boldly, to close with the bombers more often, to prove that German fighters could still dominate the skies through courage and skill. Galland understood that courage was not the issue. The men flying from grass and concrete strips across Europe did not lack determination. They had shown again and again that they were willing to take on heavily defended formations at odds that would make most rational people hesitate. What they lacked now was time. Time to train properly, time to rest, time to learn from one engagement before being thrown into another. As autumn deepened, raids against targets inside Germany grew more frequent. Schweinfurt was hit again in October in an attack that would later be known as a Black Day for the American bomber force. German fighters tore into the formations and inflicted grievous losses. Dozens of bombers fell in flames or limped away with damaged wings and engines. Yet even on that day, the German victory was incomplete. Fighter losses remained high, and the ratio of bombers destroyed to fighters lost continued to slide toward balance. For the American side, such a day was nearly unsustainable. The heavy losses forced a pause in deep raids while units rebuilt their strength. For the German side, however, the same day contained a harsher truth. The defending fighter arm was no longer able to impose one-sided attrition. It was trading its dwindling pool of experienced pilots for enemy crews who could be replaced from a far deeper reservoir of manpower and industry. In quiet offices far from the front, the charts on Galland's desk showed lines that crossed in dangerous ways. Losses rising, experience falling, training capacity shrinking. Outside, in the factories and on the planning tables of the United States, a different set of lines was moving upward. New fighter types were entering production. New engines and fuel systems were being fitted. The long-range Lightnings that had already stretched escort range into the heart of Germany were only the opening move. For the moment, most of the German leadership saw only that raids could still be bloodied, that bombers could still be shot down in large numbers. They pointed to the wreckage of fortress bombers in German fields and forests as proof that the air defense of the Reich still worked. Few were willing to look beyond that wreckage to the deeper trend that the fighter commander had already identified. Somewhere over the Channel and the training grounds of Britain, another aircraft was being prepared for service, one that would carry the escort war even farther. The stage was being set for a new phase in the struggle for the skies, even as the fighter force of the Reich strained to hold its position against an enemy that was already thinking several moves ahead. By the closing months of 1943, the air war over Europe had reached a strange moment. The German fighter force was bleeding, yet still dangerous. American bomber crews were suffering heavy losses, yet their formations kept growing larger. Both sides had discovered that deep raids into Germany were possible, but costly enough to make every mission feel like a gamble with limited currency. Behind the front lines, planners and engineers on the Allied side had been wrestling with a single problem for more than a year. Heavy bombers could reach deep into Germany, but doing so without constant fighter protection meant accepting losses that no air force could sustain indefinitely. The long-range Lightnings with drop tanks had pushed the escort line inward, but not yet to every industrial center. They were an important step, not a complete solution. German intelligence officers had followed the development of Allied fighters as closely as their resources allowed. They knew about the earlier versions of a new American fighter that had appeared in British service. This aircraft, the Mustang, had impressed pilots at low altitude. It was fast and agile near the ground, useful for reconnaissance and ground attack. Its Allison engine, however, lacked the power and breathing capacity needed for sustained performance in the heights where heavy bombers operated. The German assessment was that the Mustang, in its current form, posed no serious threat to high-altitude bomber operations. That assessment was already out of date by the autumn of 1943. Engineers in Britain and the United States had begun testing a different marriage of airframe and engine. They took the Mustang's clean, efficient shape and installed a Merlin engine with a two-stage supercharger. This combination allowed the new Mustang to retain its speed and agility, while delivering power at altitudes above 30,000 feet where the air grew thin. With external fuel tanks bolted under its wings, this updated fighter could fly far beyond the old limits that German planners still trusted. On paper, the numbers were striking. A Merlin-powered Mustang with 2 drop tanks could fly more than 800 miles from its base, spend time over the target area, and still have enough fuel to return. The straight-line distance from England to Berlin was roughly 600 miles. With this new aircraft, every major industrial target in Germany, from the Ruhr to the capital itself, lay within reach of escorted daylight bombing. The transition from theory to practice came quickly. On the 1st of December 1943, the 354th Fighter Group, recently arrived in England, flew the first combat mission of the new Mustang variant over Europe. The pilots had trained on different fighters back in the United States, and many of them had very little time in the Mustang. Some had logged only a few hours in the cockpit before being sent into combat. The aircraft's handling characteristics helped bridge that gap. It responded smoothly to control inputs, accelerated quickly, and allowed inexperienced pilots to feel comfortable much sooner than might have been expected. Within days, the new fighter began to stretch its legs. On the 5th of December, Mustangs escorted bombers to targets in northern France. On the 11th, they reached the German coast near Emden. These early missions hinted at what the aircraft could do, but did not yet show the full extent of its range. That moment arrived on the 13th of December, when 55 Mustangs accompanied B-17 bombers to Kiel, far up the Baltic coast. The distance from the English bases to Kiel and back pushed beyond what previous escorts could manage. Yet on that day, the Mustangs not only reached the target, they engaged German fighters over it, shot down several, and completed the 4.5-hour mission without losing a single aircraft to enemy fighters. American bombers hit submarine construction facilities with minimal disruption from the defenders. For the airmen involved, it felt like a hard but successful day. For those studying the larger picture, it signaled something more. The escort problem that had haunted American planners since 1942 had finally been solved. News of these missions filtered into German intelligence summaries and then onto Gallen's desk. As before, he looked at distances, fuel loads, reported altitudes, and times over target. The pattern was impossible to ignore. A new fighter had appeared that could match German interceptors at the heights where the bomber war was fought and still fly far enough to accompany those bombers almost anywhere inside Germany. The earlier shock of long-range lightnings had been serious. This new development was worse. The Mustang combined high-altitude speed with a turning ability that allowed it to dogfight on roughly equal terms with the Bf-109 and the Focke-Wulf 190. It climbed efficiently, could be positioned above incoming bomber streams, and could remain with those bombers even as they crossed deep into the interior. With drop tanks attached, it had the endurance to answer calls for help anywhere along the bomber route. Once those tanks were empty, pilots could jettison them and fight with a clean, responsive airframe. Galland recognized very quickly what this meant for his fighter force. The long-range lightnings had already overturned the assumption that escorts would drop away early. The Mustang threatened to eliminate any remaining gaps in coverage. There would be no safe zones in central Germany where bombers might be caught unescorted. Wherever German fighters massed for an attack, there was a growing chance that Mustangs would be waiting or would arrive in time to interfere. He reacted in the only way he knew. He assembled technical data, combat reports, and intelligence summaries into a coherent picture. He noted that the new fighter was faster than his main frontline types at many altitudes and able to match or exceed their performance in a climb. He highlighted its range, explaining that with external tanks it could reach any target that American planners considered worth striking. He repeated his earlier argument that the German air defense system could not continue operating on assumptions that no longer matched reality. In late December 1943, Galland traveled to Berlin to present his findings. He described the new fighter's capabilities and the implications for the future of the air war. He argued that the German Air Force needed to respond with urgency. The focus, he believed, should shift decisively toward fighter production and pilot training. The jet-powered Me-262, still struggling through development and production bottlenecks, needed priority as an interceptor rather than as a light bomber. Only a significant technological leap, combined with a reformed training pipeline, might blunt the growing Allied advantage. The reaction he met was almost unchanged from that morning on the East Prussian platform. The Mustang was discussed as if it were simply another type among many. Confidence in German pilot skill and tactical ingenuity remained high in the words of senior leaders, even as the statistics on Gallen's charts told a different story. Where he saw a structural imbalance, they saw a challenge to be overcome through greater boldness and belief in eventual victory. In the skies, events continued to support Gallen's view. As more Mustang groups arrived in England and converted to the new model, the shape of American escort coverage began to change. Fighter units were now capable of ranging far ahead of the bomber streams, searching for German formations while they climbed and assembled. Others could stay with the bombers throughout the mission, peeling off only when fuel demands absolutely required it. For German pilots, this meant that the airspace around their own country grew more hostile with each passing week. Climb out from their bases was no longer a relatively safe phase. Forming up above the clouds became dangerous as roving escort fighters probed known assembly areas. Returning home after exhausting battles did not guarantee relief. Mustangs with fuel to spare could follow damaged fighters back toward their airfields and pick off stragglers. Inside Gallen's headquarters, maps began to fill with more markers than anyone could comfortably explain away. Reports described Mustangs over targets in central Germany, over industrial centers that had once been considered too distant for regular escort coverage. Pilots who survived first encounters with the new fighter reported its speed, its rapid acceleration in dives, and its persistent presence during long missions. The broader German leadership still pointed to individual successes as proof that the situation was not irreversible. Some raids were turned back. Some bomber formations suffered crippling losses. Photographs circulated of shattered American aircraft scattered across fields and forests. They made for compelling images, but they did little to alter the trend lines that Gallen watched. The Americans, for their part, were preparing to press their advantage. With long-range escorts now available in growing numbers, strategic planners could revisit targets that had previously been deemed too costly to attack on a regular basis. Aircraft factories, engine plants, and synthetic fuel facilities were all placed under renewed scrutiny. It was no longer just a question of whether bombers could reach them once. With the Mustang in service, planners could begin to think in terms of repeated, sustained pressure. As the year turned from 1943 to 1944, Gallen stood at a difficult crossroads. He had warned about the long-range lightnings and been ignored. He had now warned about the Mustang, and the response had been essentially the same. His position demanded that he continue to oversee a fighter force that was being asked to perform tasks its leaders no longer equipped it to handle. On paper, squadrons still existed and new aircraft still arrived from factories. In the air, however, the balance was shifting steadily. The next phase would reveal just how much that shift mattered. Allied planners were assembling a campaign designed not simply to protect bombers or to hit individual targets, but to draw the German fighter arm into a series of battles it could not afford. With Mustangs, Thunderbolts, and Lightnings now able to range widely over the Reich, they were ready to use their advantage not just to guard formations, but to hunt the defenders themselves. The winter skies of 1944 would become the arena in which that strategy unfolded, and in which Gallen's grim calculations would begin to match the lived experience of his pilots day after day. The opening weeks of 1944 looked different from the ground than they did from Gallen's desk. In German towns, the winter felt harsh but familiar. Trains still ran, factories still produced engines and airframes, and the nightly blackouts had become part of ordinary life. In the skies above, however, subtle changes were already unfolding. American fighter groups in England were adjusting to a new set of instructions. For most of the war, escort fighters had been ordered to stay close to the bomber formations they guarded. Their job had been simple in theory: keep enemy fighters away from the heavy bombers at all costs, even if it meant ignoring tempting targets elsewhere. The escorts had flown tight patterns, weaving above and beside the bomber streams like a protective shell. When General James Doolittle took command of the 8th Air Force in January 1944, he inherited a growing fleet of long-range fighters and a bomber force that had already tasted the limits of unescorted raids. He also understood something that had become obvious to anyone studying the numbers. As long as the German fighter arm remained intact, every deep mission into the Reich would carry a risk that could never be entirely tamed. The new doctrine he introduced did not change the goal of protecting bombers, but it altered the method dramatically. Instead of tethering fighters tightly to the formations, he gave them freedom to roam. Escort units would still be present when the bombers needed them most, but they were now encouraged to seek out German fighters wherever those fighters gathered. The mission was no longer only to shield bombers. It was to destroy the enemy's ability to contest the air at all. This shift played directly into the strengths of the new long-range escorts. Mustang groups could now range far ahead of the bomber columns, climbing to altitude and sweeping across known assembly areas where German squadrons formed up before their attacks. Thunderbolt and Lightning units could be sent to prowl around airfields, waiting for German fighters to take off or return from missions. The idea was simple and ruthless. Do not merely push the defenders away from the bombers. Hunt them. For German pilots, the change became evident in disturbing ways. Where previous missions had allowed time to climb, join formation and approach the bomber stream before contact, the new pattern often brought combat much earlier. Climbing through cloud or haze, pilots would suddenly find long-range fighters overhead, already in advantageous positions. Surprise, once a tool used by German units planning ambushes, began to slip to the other side. Galland watched as reports of these encounters accumulated. Patrols that had not yet even sighted the bomber formations were now being broken up by aggressive American fighters. Airfields that had once provided at least a moment of security at the end of a mission were increasingly attacked by low-flying Mustangs that swooped into strafe runways and parked aircraft. The line between frontline and rear area blurred as Allied fighters began appearing almost anywhere, at almost any stage of a German sortie. In February 1944, this new approach was put to the test on a scale that left no refuge for hopeful illusions. Allied planners launched a concentrated series of raids known later as Big Week. For 6 days, bomber formations targeted German aircraft factories, engine plants and related industries across the Reich. The objective was twofold: destroy the material base of the fighter force, and force that force into constant battle under conditions that favored the Allies. More than 3,500 American bombers took part over the course of the campaign. They did not fly alone. Swarms of long-range fighters accompanied them, spreading out ahead, alongside and behind the great streams of heavy aircraft. German controllers found their plotting tables crowded with tracks, far more than they could meaningfully track or intercept in an organized way. The fighter units of the Luftwaffe responded with everything they had. Experienced aces flew multiple missions in a single day, sometimes landing only long enough to refuel and rearm before launching again. Young pilots fresh from abbreviated training courses were thrown into the same maelstrom, often without enough flight hours to be fully comfortable with their machines. In the air, the scale of the struggle dwarfed anything that had gone before. Over central Germany, contrails braided together into thick white scars as fighters and bombers clashed at high altitude. German pilots broke through escort screens where they could, still managing to inflict damage on the heavy formations. Bombers fell, leaving smoking trails as crews bailed out or rode their stricken aircraft down. Yet every attack seemed to draw more American fighters into the fight. By the end of Big Week, the cost to the Luftwaffe was staggering. Fighter units reported hundreds of aircraft destroyed or so badly damaged that immediate repair was impossible. Worse than the machines were the pilots. The casualty lists noted men who had flown from the earliest days of the war. Squadron commanders, formation leaders, and long-serving aces were gone, their experience gone with them. American losses were also significant. Dozens of bombers failed to return. Families in the United States received telegrams that winter informing them of sons missing over Europe. From a purely human perspective, both sides paid heavily. From a strategic point of view, however, there was a difference that Galland could not ignore. The Allies could replace their losses with machines and men drawn from an industrial base and a training system that had not yet been seriously disrupted. For Germany, every aircraft lost and every pilot killed cut into a reserve that was already dangerously thin. In March, as winter began to loosen its grip, the consequences of Big Week merged into an already dire trend. Galland continued to compile data, tracking losses over the preceding months. Fighter pilot casualties from January through April approached totals that would once have seemed unimaginable. Entire squadrons found themselves reduced to small groups of exhausted survivors, bolstered by newcomers whose training had been shortened again and again as fuel supplies dwindled. Meanwhile, Allied planners seized upon the momentum they had created. Freed by the presence of long-range escorts, they placed new pins on their target maps. One city in particular held powerful symbolic and strategic weight. Berlin, the capital of the Reich, had already suffered from night raids by the British Royal Air Force. Now the question was whether it could be struck in daylight by American heavy bombers under full fighter escort. For years, Hermann Göring had boasted that such a thing would never happen while he commanded the air defenses of Germany. The promise had been repeated in speeches, in radio addresses, and in private conversations. It was both a declaration of confidence and a measure by which others would inevitably judge his performance. In the operations rooms of the 8th Air Force, planners traced the route from bases in England to the German capital and back. With the Mustang and other long-range escorts now available in greater numbers, the mission moved from theoretical to possible. Fuel calculations, timing, expected weather conditions, and the likely reaction of German defenders were all weighed. The risks were real. Berlin sat deep inside heavily defended territory. Long stretches of the route would expose bombers and fighters to flak and interception. Yet for Allied command, the potential impact of such a raid was too significant to ignore. From Gallen's perspective, the looming threat was unmistakable. Reports already spoke of Mustangs appearing over targets that had once been considered too far for regular coverage. If those fighters could now accompany bombers all the way to Berlin, then no part of the Reich would remain beyond the reach of escorted daylight attack. The psychological and operational effects would be immense. In early March 1944, the decision was made. Preparations began for a series of missions that would test the strength of the German fighter arm at its very core. Pilots on both sides sensed that something larger than another raid was approaching, even if they did not yet know all the details. On the airfields of England, ground crews worked through cold winds to ready bombers and fighters for the long journey east. In Germany, controllers and intelligence officers scanned their own reports, trying to predict where the next major blow would fall. The answer would come soon, carried on the drone of hundreds of engines crossing the North Sea at dawn, and on the wings of Mustangs whose presence over the German capital would mark a moment from which there would be no return to earlier assumptions. On the morning of the 4th of March 1944, the air over northern Europe seemed deceptively calm. On the ground, people went about wartime routines that had become almost ordinary. In England, villagers heard the familiar rumble from distant airfields as hundreds of engines turned over in the early light. In Germany, air raid sirens stood silent for the moment, their metal mouths waiting for the next alarm. Above the cold waters of the North Sea, contrails were already beginning to draw pale lines against the sky. From bases spread across eastern England, more than 600 heavy bombers lifted off and turned eastward. They formed up in vast, layered streams, the kind of formations that observers described as airborne cities. Alongside and above them, long-range fighters took their own positions. Among these escorts were nearly 200 P-51 Mustangs, their extended-range tanks slung beneath their wings, their engines tuned for the long journey into the heart of the Reich. The destination that day was Berlin, the capital that had for years been held up as untouchable by daylight attack under full escort. For a long time, the idea of American heavy bombers flying over the city at noon, accompanied all the way by fighters, had been treated on the German side as a kind of fantasy or nightmare. It would mean that the promise of invulnerable air defenses had failed. It would mean that no center of power, however symbolic, lay beyond the reach of enemy air arms. As the formations crossed the German border, radar stations picked up their approach and controllers began to plot their tracks. The sheer number of aircraft crowding the plotting tables told its own story. This was not a probing attack or a limited strike. It was a deliberate attempt to test whether the German fighter force could still defend its own core. Orders went out to scramble units across a broad swath of central Germany. Pilots hurried to their aircraft, engines coughed to life, and fighters clawed upward through layers of cloud. In previous years, the climb to altitude had offered at least a few minutes of relative safety. Crews checked instruments, adjusted oxygen masks, and formed up with their squadron mates before heading toward the bomber streams. This time, the new escort doctrine and the presence of long-range fighters altered that rhythm. Mustangs that had moved ahead of the bombers began to appear along the routes German fighters used to reach their assembly points. Pilots who had expected to see only friendly machines around them suddenly found sleek American fighters dropping out of broken cloud or sliding in from the sun. Battles broke out far from the main bomber formations, sometimes before the German units had fully organized themselves. Every minute spent in these scattered engagements was a minute not spent massing for coordinated attacks on the heavy aircraft that continued their steady approach toward Berlin. Despite these disruptions, German fighters did reach the bombers in places. They dived in from the front and the sides, still employing the tactics that had been refined through years of combat. Some bombers fell, spiraling away from the tight formations that gave them mutual protection. Others staggered on toward the target, riddled with holes, their crews fighting fires or tending to wounded comrades. Yet above and around these scenes, the Mustangs and other escorts pressed their own attacks. Over the outskirts of the capital, they engaged defenders in a series of swirling dogfights that pitted experienced German pilots against opponents who now enjoyed both numerical and technical advantages. In contrast to earlier periods, the escorts did not simply break away once the bombers had dropped their loads. They remained, harrying returning fighters and guarding the bomber streams on their way out as carefully as on their way in. From the streets of Berlin, civilians looked up at a sight that would have been unthinkable only a year earlier. High above the city, in the thin air where contrails formed and merged, heavy bombers crossed in broad lanes, flanked by the tiny glints of their escorts. The thunder of engines, the distant crump of anti-aircraft fire, and the scattered falls of wreckage spoke of a new phase in the war. The capital of the Reich, which had been promised immunity from such daylight raids, now lay exposed beneath the moving grid of Allied air power. For Galland, the significance of that day went far beyond the immediate damage inflicted on factories or railway yards. The presence of Mustangs over Berlin confirmed every calculation he had made about their range. It showed that the promise he had heard so often from above, that enemy bombers would never reach the capital under fighter escort, had been overtaken by events. In private, he knew that some senior figures now admitted as much. In public, the message remained one of defiance and confidence. The numbers that followed were even more troubling than the symbolism. The escorted raid on Berlin was not an isolated feat, it was the first of a series. With long-range fighters now available in growing strength, American planners could schedule repeated missions toward the capital and other deep targets, accepting losses that, while painful, could be absorbed and replaced. Each new operation forced the German fighter force to respond, spending pilots and aircraft it could no longer easily spare. In the weeks that followed, Galland continued to receive casualty summaries from fighter units across Germany. The pattern that had begun in the previous year now accelerated. Pilots who had survived years of combat fell in skirmishes with Mustangs and other escorts. Some were lost attacking bombers under heavy fire, but an increasing number were shot down while trying to reach or leave the battle area. At the same time, the quality of replacements kept slipping. Fuel shortages had reduced flying hours at training schools to levels that would once have been considered dangerously low. Some new pilots arrived at frontline units with fewer than 200 total hours in the air, much of it on training aircraft very different from the high-performance machines they were now expected to master. Galland understood that this erosion of skill could not be offset by bravery. He knew from his own experience that a fighter pilot needed many months to develop the instinctive reactions required to survive repeated engagements. Without enough practice, even naturally gifted newcomers would make mistakes that might prove fatal within their first few missions. Reports from squadron leaders confirmed this. They spoke of novices who struggled to hold formation, who became disoriented in cloud, who panicked when suddenly bounced by enemy fighters with a height advantage. By late April 1944, the situation had deteriorated to the point where Galland felt compelled to bypass normal channels. On the 27th of that month, he completed a detailed report addressed directly to the highest levels of command. In it, he laid out the state of the fighter force in stark quantitative terms. He noted that in the most recent major operations, hundreds of fighters had been lost or badly damaged. Over the preceding 4 months, more than 1,000 fighter pilots had been killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. In some engagements, Allied fighters outnumbered German defenders by margins of 6-1 or even 8-1. He emphasized that the average Allied pilot entered combat with 400 to 500 flying hours, while many German pilots now went into battle with less than half that experience. The report also highlighted the collapse of the training infrastructure. Flight schools lacked sufficient fuel. Training airfields came under increasing attack from Allied aircraft, destroying machines and killing instructors who could not easily be replaced. Even as factories managed to increase the production of fighter airframes, there were not enough well-trained pilots to fly them or enough maintenance capacity to keep them serviceable under constant strain. One passage in the document expressed a comparison that summed up Gallen's view of the technological imbalance. He wrote that he would, at that moment, rather have a single operational Me-262 jet fighter than 5 additional Bf-109s. The jet's speed, he believed, offered the only realistic chance of breaking through escort screens to reach bomber formations with some degree of safety. Yet development of this aircraft had been repeatedly delayed, and its intended role diverted toward ground attack by higher authority. When the report left his hands, Galland knew that its contents could not be misunderstood. It was not a plea for more aggressive spirit or for stronger propaganda. It was a statement that, without immediate and radical changes, the fighter arm would cross a threshold from which it could not recover. Once the pool of experienced pilots fell below a certain point, no amount of new aircraft or rhetorical encouragement would restore combat effectiveness. The response he received did not match the urgency of his words. Official statements continued to stress the resilience of German defenses. Orders still prioritized immediate frontline needs over long-term training reform. Resources were directed toward operations that offered political or symbolic value, even when they consumed aircraft and pilots at a rate that the system could not sustain. Outside, the skies told their own story. Escorted raids continued, bearing down on aircraft plants, fuel production sites, and transportation networks. German fighters rose to meet them whenever they could, but each effort left more gaps in squadrons that were already stretched thin. The raid on Berlin had shown what was now possible for the Allies. Gallen's report had shown what was now impossible for the Luftwaffe without fundamental change. Between those two realities lay a widening gulf that could no longer be bridged by hope or habit. It could only be measured in lost aircraft, empty bunks in pilots' quarters, and the growing presence of foreign bombers and fighters over the very heart of Germany, where once the air had seemed to belong securely to the defenders alone.